Theron Ashvane had not set foot in Thornhallow in 2 years. He had not planned to. The fortress sat at the edge of the Greymark Mountains, like a wound that refused to close. All crumbling stone and dead silence and memories that tasted like ash. He'd sealed it himself after the massacre. Locked the gates, ordered the roads salted, and walked away without looking back. Now he stood in the great hall of his ancestral home, surrounded by dust and ruin, and stared at the impossible thing lying on the floor in front of him. A girl. She lay curled on her side on the bare stone, her dark auburn hair fanned beneath her head like a pillow she'd fashioned from nothing. One arm was tucked under her cheek, the other cradled a worn leather satchel against her chest. And between the fingers of that same hand, a sprig of dried lavender was crumbling to dust. She was thin, painfully thin. The kind of thin that spoke of weeks on the road with not enough food and too much distance behind her. Her clothes were patched and travel-stained, mended so many times in places that the original fabric was more memory than material. Her boots were unlaced and set neatly beside her, side by side, with a care that struck him as oddly deliberate, as though she'd meant to rest for only a moment, and then never gotten back up. She was breathing. Slow, impossibly, deep breaths that fogged in the cold air of the hall. Her face was pale but calm, her lips slightly parted, her expression so utterly at peace, it looked almost sacred. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheekbone, a thin scratch across the bridge of her nose, half-healed details that made her real in a way that unsettled him far more than if she'd been some perfect, ghostly apparition. She was real. And she was alive, in a place where nothing had been alive for 2 years. How long had she been sleeping? Days at least, judging by the thin layer of dust that had settled around her, but not on her, as if the fortress itself were keeping a careful distance. A water skin lay half-empty near her hip. A crust of bread, untouched and stale, sat beside her satchel. She'd prepared to rest. She hadn't prepared to stay. "Sire." Soren's voice came from behind him, low and controlled, the way his beta spoke when he was working very hard not to sound alarmed. "We should wake her." Theron didn't respond. He couldn't. Something had locked his muscles the moment he'd seen her, something deep and primal and utterly beyond his control. Soren stepped forward, one hand extended toward the girl's shoulder, and Theron's wolf woke up. It hit him like a wall of fire. 2 years? 2 years of silence, of reaching inward and finding nothing but a hollow echo where his other half should have been. 2 years of his wolf, lying dormant, unreachable, gone, in every way that mattered. Now it surged forward with a violence that nearly buckled his knees. A snarl tore from his throat, guttural and savage, and before he could process what was happening, his body had moved. He was between Soren and the girl. His hand was around his beta's wrist. His grip was crushing. The sound that came out of him wasn't human. Soren froze. His eyes went wide. Not with fear. Soren had fought beside Theron in 3 campaigns and had earned the right to be afraid of very little. But with shock. Pure, unfiltered shock. "Theron," Soren breathed, barely a whisper, "your wolf." The 4 guards behind them had drawn their weapons on instinct. Theron could hear their pulses hammering, could smell the adrenaline bleeding off their skin. His senses hadn't been this sharp in years. Everything felt raw, heightened, almost painful. His wolf was roaring inside him. Not words. Wolves didn't speak in words. But the message was deafening in its clarity. Do not touch her. Not him. Not anyone. She is ours to guard. Ours. The word hit Theron like a slap. He released Soren's wrist and stumbled back a step, breathing hard. His hands were shaking. His vision had gone slightly gold at the edges, the telltale sign of a partial shift he hadn't been capable of in over 2 years. He could feel the wolf pressing outward against his skin, could feel the prickle of fur threatening to break through, could feel teeth aching to sharpen in his jaw. His body was remembering what his mind had grieved as lost. "No one touches her," Theron said, His voice came out rough, scraped from somewhere deep. "No one wakes her. Sire, she could be a threat," one of the guards ventured, his sword still half drawn. "An assassin, a spy." The fortress was sealed. No one should be able to. "Does she look like an assassin to you?" Theron snapped, turning on the man with enough force that the guard stumbled back a full step. He gestured at the girl, the thin wrists, the patched clothing, the satchel pressed against her chest like it was all she had in the world. "Put your sword away before I take it from you." The guard sheathed his blade so fast the metal sang. The girl didn't stir. Not at his snarl, not at the commotion, not at the sound of drawn steel. Her breathing stayed deep and even and utterly undisturbed, as if all of this, the ruined fortress, the armed men, the snarling Alpha King, was happening in a world she had no part in. Soren straightened, slowly rubbing his wrist. He looked at Theron, then down at the girl, then back at Theron. The beta's expression shifted from shock to something more complicated, something that looked disturbingly like hope. "Your wolf," Soren said again, quieter this time. "It's back." Theron didn't answer, because the truth was worse than Soren knew. His wolf wasn't just back. It was standing guard, and it would not let him walk away from this girl if his life depended on it. The wind howled through the broken windows of the great hall, sending dust spiraling through the gray light. And on the cold stone floor of a dead fortress, a girl, no one knew, slept on, undisturbed, while the most dangerous alpha in the realm stood over her like a sentinel and had no earthly idea why. The worst part wasn't the confusion, or the fear, or the fact that his wolf had chosen this moment, this stranger, to come roaring back to life after 2 years of grieving silence. The worst part was that deep beneath the chaos, beneath the snarl and the surge and the gold bleeding into his vision, something in his chest had gone very, very quiet. And it felt, for the first time since Valdrick's blood had cooled on his hands, like peace. To understand why Theron Ashvane's wolf had been silent for 2 years, you had to understand what happened at Thornhallow. The official account was clean. A border skirmish with a rogue faction that escalated, a decisive battle, a victory that secured the Northern Territories for a generation. The histories would record troop movements, strategic maneuvers, and a death toll that was regrettable but necessary. The truth was nothing like that. 2 years ago, Theron had ridden to Thornhallow to put down the Ashenmore Rebellion, a faction of his own wolves, led by his former captain of the guard, a man named Valdrick, who had been like a second father to Theron since childhood, the man who had taught him to shift, the man who had stood beside his real father's deathbed and sworn to protect the boy king with his life. Valdrick had been the first to show signs of the hollowing, a slow, irreversible madness that ate the bond between human and wolf until only the beast remained. It started with small things, a flash of uncharacteristic temper, a forgetting of names. Then came the paranoia, then the rage, then a severing, so complete that the person you knew simply ceased to exist behind their own eyes. The healers said there was no cure, but Theron had refused to accept that. Not Valdrick, not the man who'd carried him on his shoulders as a boy, not the man who'd wept at his father's funeral and then straightened his spine and said, "You're the king now, lad, and I'll make sure you're ready." By the time Theron received word, Valdrick had taken 40 wolves into the Greymark Mountains and claimed Thornhallow as his stronghold. He dragged civilians with him, families, children. Not as hostages, but because the Hollowed couldn't tell the difference between loyalty and captivity anymore. The line between protector and predator had blurred into nothing. Theron had tried to negotiate. He'd ridden to the gates of his own ancestral fortress and begged the man who'd raised him to stand down. Valdrick hadn't recognized him. What followed was the worst night of Theron's life. He gave the order. His wolves breached the walls. And in the great hall, the same hall where a girl now slept on the stone floor, Theron had killed Valdrick with his own hands. The old captain had fought like a thing possessed, because that's exactly what the hollowing made you. There was no reasoning, no reaching the man beneath the madness, There was only the terrible grinding necessity of ending something that couldn't be saved. Theron's wolf had gone silent the moment Valdric stopped breathing. Not quiet, not withdrawn. Silent, as if something fundamental had been severed, a cord cut clean. He'd reached inward and found empty space where his wolf had lived for 26 years. The healers called it grief shock. Weeks turned to months, months turned to a year, then two. His wolf never stirred. An alpha without his wolf was a contradiction, a throne balanced on a cracked foundation. The council didn't say it openly, but Theron could read the worry in the creases of their faces, could hear the whispers that skittered through the court like mice behind the walls. How long before a challenger sensed the weakness? How long before someone younger, stronger, whole, decided the throne would suit them better? It was the council that forced his return to Thornhallow. Reclaim the fortress or cede it to the northern lords. An abandoned ancestral seat was a symbol of fracture, and the realm couldn't afford symbols like that. Not now. So, Theron had ridden north with Soren and a small escort. He told himself it was politics. Just stone and timber and strategic positioning. He told himself he could walk those halls and feel nothing. He'd been wrong about that. The moment they'd crossed through the gates, the memories had hit him like a physical blow. The courtyard where Valdric had taught him to spar. The kitchens where the old captain had snuck him honeycakes after training. The corridor outside the great hall where Theron had stood, covered in blood that wasn't his, and listened to the silence that meant it was over. Sire, Soren had touched his shoulder then, and Theron had realized he'd stopped walking. His hands were fists at his sides, his jaw locked so tight his molars ground together. "I'm fine," Theron had said. The lie tasted stale. They'd pushed deeper. The fortress was a ruin. 2 years of mountain weather had cracked the mortar, collapsed a section of the eastern wall, and turned the upper chambers into nesting grounds for crows. Water damage had warped the wooden floors. Frost had split the stone in places. Nature was slowly reclaiming what violence had emptied. It was Soren who'd pushed open the doors to the great hall. Theron had steeled himself for what he'd find. The long table overturned, the Ashvane banners torn, the stone where Valdric had fallen, stained dark with what no amount of rain through broken windows could wash clean. He'd been prepared for ghosts. He'd been prepared for grief. He had not been prepared for her. "There's someone here," Soren had said, his hand dropping to his blade. Theron had stepped past him and stopped. The great hall was wrecked. Debris from the collapsed upper gallery littered the floor. The long table lay on its side. The banners hung in rotting strips. And in the center of it all, in a small, clear space on the stone floor where no dust had gathered, a girl was sleeping. Not hiding, not injured, not dead, sleeping. Peacefully, deeply, absurdly sleeping in the ruins of a sealed fortress that no one had entered in 2 years. The contrast was so jarring it felt like a hallucination. Death and decay in every direction, and at the center of it, this small, breathing thing curled on her side like the world hadn't ended around her. How had she gotten in? The gates were chained. The walls were intact except for the eastern collapse, and that section was a sheer 3-story drop onto jagged rock. There were no tracks in the dust of the corridors, no sign of forced entry, no evidence of another living soul anywhere in the fortress. Just her, breathing, still, a leather satchel of herbs clutched against her chest like a child holding a stuffed animal, a sprig of dried lavender crumbling between her fingers. Theron had approached slowly, some instinct telling him to move carefully, the way you'd approach a sleeping animal in the wild. Not because she was dangerous, but because something about the scene felt fragile. Sacred, almost like a thing that shouldn't be disturbed. Like if he made too much noise, the spell would break, and she'd vanish, and he'd be left standing alone in the ruin again, surrounded by nothing but ghosts. That's when he'd noticed it. The smell. Beneath the dust and damp stone and decay of the fortress, there was something else. Something warm, alive. a scent that slipped past every defense he had and settled somewhere behind his ribs like a key turning in a lock he didn't know existed. Chamomile. Rain-soaked earth. Something beneath both that had no name, only a feeling. A deep, bone-level recognition that his mind couldn't explain and his body couldn't ignore. And for the first time in 2 years, something stirred inside him. His wolf opened its eyes. They stayed for 3 hours. Theron sat on the overturned long table, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the girl, and tried to make sense of what was happening inside his own body. His wolf was awake. Not fully present, it wasn't speaking to him, wasn't pushing for control the way it had in those first violent seconds when Soren reached for her, but it was there. A warm pressure behind his sternum, a low hum in the back of his skull, a sharpening of his senses that he'd forgotten was possible. For 2 years, reaching for his wolf had been like pressing his hand against a wall of ice, cold, flat. Nothing. Now, there was heat, faint, but unmistakable, like embers buried under ash that hadn't quite died, and every time he looked at the girl, it flared. She hasn't moved, Soren observed from the doorway, where he'd been keeping a careful distance since Theron's snarl had nearly taken his hand off. Not even a twitch. That isn't normal sleep. Theron knew that. Normal sleepers shifted, adjusted, reacted to sound and cold, and the presence of strangers standing over them, having a quiet crisis. This girl hadn't so much as changed the rhythm of her breathing. "We can't stay here indefinitely," Soren continued. "The men are asking questions. And respectfully, sire, you did just growl at me, like you were about to rip my throat out, so I'd appreciate some explanation." Theron said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than he intended. My wolf responded to her. The silence that followed was deafening. "Responded?" Soren repeated carefully. "It woke up, Soren." For the first time in 2 years, it woke up. Theron didn't look at his beta. He kept his gaze on the girl. "When you reached for her, it came forward so fast I couldn't control it. I didn't even know what was happening until I had your wrist." Soren processed this with the calm efficiency that made him invaluable. "Then, we bring her back to the capital. She's unconscious. She's breathing fine. Heart rate is steady. No visible injuries." Soren moved closer now, though he stopped well outside arm's reach. "A quick learner. We can transport her safely. But leaving her on a stone floor in a ruin isn't an option, and neither is sitting here until she decides to wake up on her own." He was right. Theron hated that he was right, because some irrational, wolf-driven part of him wanted to stay exactly where he was, keeping watch until she opened her eyes. The impulse was so foreign, so completely unlike anything he'd felt in 2 years, that it frightened him. He lifted her himself, refused to let anyone else do it. The moment his arms closed around her, his wolf surged so powerfully, his vision went gold. She weighed almost nothing. Her head fell against his shoulder and her hair brushed his jaw, and the scent of her, that disarming, nameless scent, wrapped around him so tightly he had to stop walking and just breathe. "Sire?" Soren asked, watching him with sharp eyes. "I'm fine," Theron managed. It was the second time he'd said it today. It was less convincing than the first. He carried her out of Thornhallow, through the courtyard where his mentor had taught him to fight, past the gates he'd sealed with his own hands, and into the gray mountain daylight. She didn't stir. Not when the wind hit her face. Not when the cold mountain air raised bumps across her exposed skin. Not when his arms tightened around her as the trail narrowed and dropped along the ridge. He rode with her in front of him in the saddle, one arm locked around her waist, to keep her from slipping. Her head rested against his collarbone, and he could feel her heartbeat through the thin fabric of her shirt, slow and steady, and strangely calm. She was warm. That struck him harder than it should have. He'd expected cold, the chill of something wrong, something unnatural. But she was warm and alive, and breathing against his neck, and his wolf had gone. utterly still inside him for the first time since the Great Hall. Not silent, the way it had been for 2 years, but settled, content, like a hound that had found its place by the fire. The ride back to the capital took 6 hours. She slept through every one of them. Theron's wolf didn't subside for a single moment. It stayed at the surface, alert, watchful, radiating a protective fury that made the horses nervous. And the guards ride at double their usual distance. Twice, a scout rode too close, and Theron felt the growl building in his chest before he could stop it. This was madness. He didn't know this girl. She could be anyone, a vagrant, a spy, someone planted in the ruins to exploit whatever weakness she'd found. The rational part of his mind catalogued every possibility. His wolf dismissed all of it. She was important. She was his to protect. That was the beginning and end of it. They reached the capital as the sun was setting. Theron carried her through the side entrance to avoid the court's attention, though he knew the whispers would start within the hour. A king carrying an unconscious stranger into his palace wasn't something you could keep quiet. He brought her to the east wing, the guest chambers closest to his own rooms, though he refused to examine why proximity mattered. He set her on the bed with a gentleness that surprised even him, and when he pulled his arms away, his wolf howled with displeasure so loudly he flinched. "Get Thessaly," he told Soren now. Thessaly arrived within minutes, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had been the court healer for longer than Theron had been alive. Her silver hair was pinned in a tight coil, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they swept the room. The unconscious girl, the rigid king standing over her, the beta hovering in the doorway. "Pah! Out!" Thessaly said to Theron. "No." Thessaly raised one eyebrow. It was the kind of eyebrow that had cowed 3 kings before this one. "Your Majesty, I need to examine her. You're standing close enough to count her eyelashes, and you look like you'd bite anyone who touches her. That isn't helpful." "My wolf," Theron started. "Your wolf can wait on the other side of that door," Thessaly pointed. "I promise I won't harm your stray." The word stray landed somewhere uncomfortable. Theron opened his mouth to argue, caught the look on Thessaly's face, and recognized the immovable force that had once made him drink an entire cup of bitter tonic by sheer force of disapproval. He left. He stood in the corridor outside the door, arms crossed, jaw tight, and listened to every sound from within. His wolf paced restlessly inside him, a caged thing prowling the borders of his control. 20 minutes passed. 30. Each one felt like an hour. When Thessaly finally opened the door, her expression had changed. The professional calm was still there, but beneath it was something Theron hadn't seen on the old healer's face in years: confusion. "She's healthy," Thessaly said slowly. "Malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise sound. No injuries, no signs of poison or sedation. No curse markers that I can detect." She paused, choosing her next words with unusual care. "But she won't wake. I've tried everything. Stimulants, smelling salts, pressure points. Her body is asleep, and it's staying that way." "What does that mean?" Theron demanded. Thessaly looked at him steadily. "It means this girl hasn't just been sleeping, Your Majesty." She glanced back at the still figure on the bed. "She's been somewhere else entirely, and wherever she is, she's not ready to come back yet." A chill crawled down Theron's spine. Behind him, the last light of the sunset bled through the corridor windows and died against the stone. And in the room beyond the door, the girl who had no name, no history, and no reason to be sleeping in a dead king's fortress, took one long, slow breath, and her fingers twitched. She opened her eyes 3 hours later. Theron was in the chair beside her bed when it happened. He hadn't meant to stay. He'd told Soren he was going to review the fortress reports. He'd told Thessaly he'd return in the morning. He'd told himself he was being rational about all of this. And then his wolf had refused to let him leave the corridor. Not with violence this time. Something worse. A deep, aching pull in his chest that intensified with every step he took away from her door, like a fishhook lodged beneath his ribs. By the time he reached the stairwell, the pull had become physical pain. He'd turned around, walked back, sat down in the chair beside her bed, and the pain had vanished instantly. So here he was. The fire was low, casting amber light across the room. The girl lay motionless under the thin coverlet Thessaly had drawn over her. Theron sat with his arms crossed, his expression rigid, and tried to convince himself this was strategy. She was an unknown element in his palace. Watching her was simply prudent. His wolf knew better. His wolf was curled up inside him, warm and present, and radiating a contentment so foreign that Theron didn't know what to do with it. For 2 years, his chest had felt like an abandoned house, cold and echoing and full of dust. Now something was living in it again, and the sensation was so overwhelming he wanted to claw it out just so he could breathe. Her eyes opened without warning. One moment she was still. The next, her lashes fluttered, and 2 dark hazel eyes were staring at the ceiling with the blank, unfocused gaze of someone surfacing from a very deep place. Theron straightened in the chair. His wolf surged forward, pressing against the inside of his skin with an eagerness that made his pulse jump. The girl blinked. Once, twice. Her gaze traveled slowly across the unfamiliar ceiling, the stone walls, the heavy curtains, and the fire she hadn't lit. Then she turned her head and saw him. The scream she produced was impressive. Not the shriek of a courtier or the wail of a child, but the full-throated, unrestrained scream of someone who had genuinely woken up to find a strange man sitting in the dark beside their bed. She scrambled backwards so fast she nearly fell off the far side of the mattress, her hands clutching the coverlet to her chest, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. "Who are you?" she demanded. Her voice shook, but there was steel underneath it, a cornered thing ready to bite. "Where am I? How did I? What is this place?" Theron raised both hands, palms out, a gesture of peace, though he suspected it lost some of its calming effect, coming from a man his size in a dark room. "You're safe," he said. "You're in the capital. We found you sleeping in a fortress in the Greymark Mountains." She stared at him, her chest heaving. Her eyes darted to the door, to the window, back to him, assessing his size, his reach, his position between her and the only exit. "The door isn't locked," he added. "You're not a prisoner, Jai." She didn't relax, but she stopped calculating escape routes, which he took as progress. "A fortress," she repeated slowly, her brow furrowing as she dredged the memory up through whatever depths she'd been swimming in. "Thornhollow. You know it, I was looking for shelter." She pressed a hand to her forehead, wincing like the light hurt. "The mountain pass was snowing. I'd been walking for 2 days. I saw the walls through the trees and thought it was abandoned." "It is abandoned. Then what were you doing there?" The question caught him off guard. Not the words themselves, but the way she asked them, direct, almost challenging, as if she'd already forgotten she was talking to a stranger twice her size in an unfamiliar room. The fear was still there in the rigid set of her shoulders, but it was being elbowed aside by something sharper, something that looked suspiciously like irritation. "It's my fortress," Theron said. The girl went very still. Her gaze swept over him again, slower this time, taking in the quality of his clothes, the signet ring on his hand, the silver wolf clasp at his collar, the posture of a man who had never once in his life had to make himself small. "Oh," she whispered. The color drained from her face. "Oh no, what's your name?" he asked. "Eloan," she said faintly. "My name is Eloan. Please don't execute me. I wasn't trespassing on purpose, I just fell asleep. I have this condition where She stopped. Something shuddered behind her eyes. "I fall asleep sometimes," she finished carefully. "And I can't always control when." The way she said it told him everything about how that admission had been received before. The careful wording, the braced shoulders, the expectation of being called cursed, or mad, or worse. "How long has that been happening?" Theron asked. "My whole life." Her voice was barely audible. "I was left at a village healer's door as an infant. No note, no name. She raised me. taught me herbs and remedies, but the sleeping got worse as I grew older, episodes lasting hours, then days. The village, she swallowed. They asked me to leave, said I was cursed, said I'd bring misfortune on their children. Theron heard the word she'd used, asked. He suspected the truth involved torches, and locked doors, and the kind of cruelty that people convinced themselves was justified when they were afraid. "Where have you been since?" he asked. "Everywhere, nowhere." She pulled the coverlet tighter around herself, a gesture so unconsciously self-protective it made his chest tighten. "I travel. I trade remedies for food and shelter. When the episodes happen, I find somewhere quiet and hope I wake up before anyone notices." She looked around the room with new eyes, taking in the tapestries, the carved stone, the quality of the blanket wrapped around her. "This is a palace, isn't it?" "Yes." "And you're the king?" "Yes." Aloan closed her eyes. "I fell asleep in the king's castle." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half groan. "Of course I did." Something tugged at the corner of Theron's mouth. He suppressed it. "Thessaly, the court healer, examined you while you were unconscious," he said. "She found no injuries or illness, but she couldn't wake you." "No one can," Aloan said quietly. "Once it starts, it has to run its course. I've tried everything, stimulants, alarms, even had a blacksmith agree to drop a pan beside my head. Nothing works." There was a defeated weariness in the words that made something in him tighten. This girl had been carrying this alone for years, moving from place to place, falling asleep without warning, hoping each time that the world hadn't grown hostile while she was gone. "I'd like you to stay," Theron said. The words left his mouth before his brain had fully approved them. Aloan's eyes widened. "Stay?" she repeated, like the word was in a language she didn't speak. "Thessaly needs to examine you properly, and there are," he hesitated, weighing how much truth to offer a stranger. "There are reasons your presence here may be significant." "What reasons?" He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in the hazel depths of her eyes made his wolf press forward with a yearning so intense it took physical effort to stay seated. "Stay," he said again, quieter. "Please." The please landed between them like something fragile dropped from a height. Aloan stared at him. He watched her weigh the offer against every instinct that had kept her moving for years, against the learned certainty that staying anywhere too long only ended one way. "All right," she said finally. "But only because I don't have anywhere else to go, and because you said please." She paused. "Kings don't usually say please, do they?" "No," Theron admitted. "They don't." She studied him for another moment, her head tilted slightly, something shifting behind her eyes that he couldn't read. "You should get some rest, Your Majesty," she said softly. "If you don't mind me saying, you look almost as tired as I feel." Theron stood, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he almost smiled. He paused at the door and turned back. "The infirmary is in the east wing. Thessaly will expect you in the morning. If you need anything before then, there's a bell pull beside the bed." Aloan blinked. "A bell pull? It summons a servant. I've never had a bell pull in my life." She stared at the cord like it might bite her. "What if I pull it by accident? What if I pull it in my sleep?" "Then a very confused servant will arrive to find you unconscious," Theron said. "I'm told you're used to that." Aloan opened her mouth, closed it, and then laughed. It was small, and startled, and a little bit broken. The laugh of someone who hadn't expected to find anything funny in this situation and was surprised to be wrong. Theron left before she could see what that sound did to his face. Aloan didn't trust it. Not the palace, not the arrangement, not the quiet, watchful king, who had said please like it cost him something. Kindness, in her experience, was always temporary. People were generous until the first episode. They were understanding until they walked into a room and found her collapsed on the floor with no pulse they could feel and no response to any amount of shaking. Then came the fear, then the whispers, then the locked doors, and the suggestion. always framed as concern that perhaps she'd be happier somewhere else. She'd learned to keep her bag packed. She'd learned to sleep near exits. She'd learned that the fastest way to lose a home was to let yourself believe you had one, so she didn't trust it. But she stayed. Thessaly put her to work almost immediately, which helped. The court healer had taken one look at Elowen's herb knowledge and declared her useful, which in Thessaly's vocabulary appeared to be the highest form of praise available. "You know moonwort preparation," Thessaly observed on the second morning, watching Elowen strip the dried leaves with practiced fingers. "It wasn't a question. My guardian taught me. She believed in learning by doing," Elowen said. "Mostly by doing it wrong first, and getting yelled at." "Sensible woman," Thessaly replied. "You'll work with me until I decide otherwise. Mornings in the still room, afternoons in the infirmary. Keep your hands busy and your mouth quiet, and we'll get along fine." They got along wonderfully, mainly because Elowen's mouth was incapable of staying quiet for more than 10 minutes, and Thessaly, despite her stern exterior, seemed to find this more entertaining than annoying. Days folded into each other. Elowen ground herbs, prepared poultices, treated the steady stream of injuries and complaints that flowed through the infirmary. A guard with a sprained wrist, a kitchen boy with a burn, a councilman with gout, who refused to stop eating rich food and then complained about the consequences. She didn't see Theron during the days. He had a kingdom to run, and she had tinctures to brew, and the palace was large enough that two people could exist in it without ever meeting. Except he kept appearing. Not obviously. Not in ways that anyone else would notice. But Elowen noticed, because noticing things was how you survived when the world could pull the floor out from under you at any moment. He walked through the infirmary corridor twice on the third day. The infirmary was in the east wing. His study, she'd learned from Thessaly, was in the west. There was no reason for him to pass through the east wing twice, unless he was taking a route so indirect it bordered on scenic tourism. On the fourth day, a new mortar and pestle appeared on her workstation. Heavy marble, perfectly balanced, far too expensive for general infirmary use. "Where did this come from?" Elowen asked Thessaly. "No idea," Thessaly said without looking up. "It has the royal crest on the bottom." On the fifth day, she caught him. She was crossing the courtyard with an armful of dried rosemary when she spotted him standing at the upper gallery window, looking down. The moment their eyes met, he stepped back from the glass. Not quickly enough. Elowen bit her lip to keep from smiling. She failed. The same afternoon, she watched from the infirmary window as Theron trained in the yard below. Soren sparred with him, the clash of practice swords ringing off the courtyard walls. Theron moved like something barely leashed, all controlled violence and coiled power, and Elowen found herself pressing closer to the glass without realizing it. Then it happened. Mid-swing, Theron's form shifted, just for a heartbeat. His eyes blazed gold, his movements went fluid in a way that was too fast, too precise, too animal to be fully human. A partial shift, his wolf lending its strength and instinct to his body for one brilliant, electric moment. Theron froze. Soren lowered his sword. Even from the window, Elowen could see the shock on the king's face, the way his hand came up to his own chest, pressing flat over his heart like he was trying to hold something in. Then he looked up, directly at her window, as if he could feel her watching. Their eyes met across the distance, and Elowen understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones, that his wolf had surfaced because she was near. That evening she left a small jar of lavender salve outside his study door, with a note that read, "For the king who doesn't sleep well, a guard told me. The salve won't fix it, but it smells nice. And sometimes that's enough." The jar was empty by morning. She found it returned to her workstation, cleaned, with a note tucked inside in handwriting so precise it looked like architecture. "Thank you. I do not have trouble sleeping," but the scent was acceptable. Elowen kept the note. She told herself she didn't know why. On the seventh evening, she was walking back to her chambers after a late shift when she found him in the corridor outside her door. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, staring at the floor with the expression of a man who had been caught doing something he couldn't explain. "Your Majesty," Eloin said, stopping mid-step. "Are you lost?" "No. This corridor ends at my room. There's nothing else down here." I checked. "I'm aware." She waited. He didn't volunteer anything further. The lamplight flickered between them, and she noticed he wasn't wearing his formal jacket. Just a simple linen shirt, open at the collar, sleeves pushed to his elbows. It was the most undone she'd ever seen him. It made him look less like a king and more like a man, and that was somehow infinitely more dangerous. A silence stretched between them, warm and awkward and full of things neither of them was saying. Eloin studied him in the lamplight. The shadows under his eyes were deep, bruised dark. But there was something beneath the exhaustion, a restlessness, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "Thessaly tells me your wolf has been absent for a long time," Eloin said carefully. His expression shuddered. "Thessaly talks too much. She said it came back when you found me." Theron was quiet for a moment. "It's been stirring, since you arrived, more present than it's been in 2 years. He paused, then added, with the air of someone confessing to a crime. "It's the reason I keep ending up in this corridor." Eloin's heart did something complicated. "Your wolf brings you to my door, it's drawn to you. Your proximity calms it." He looked away. "I realize how that sounds. It sounds like you've been standing outside my room because your inner wolf has a crush on me." The silence that followed was spectacular. "That," Theron said slowly, "is not the word I would have chosen. What word would you have chosen?" Another pause. She watched his throat work as he swallowed. "Gravitational pull," he said finally. "Instinctive recognition. A response to some quality in your—" "A crush," Eloin repeated, smiling. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity of it stole the smile right off her face. His eyes were gray, she'd noticed that before, but in the lamplight they burned almost silver, and the weight of his gaze made her pulse stumble. "You should know something," he said quietly. "The day we brought you here, when you were still sleeping, I carried you out of Thornhallow myself. My wolf wouldn't allow anyone else to touch you. During the ride you were—" He stopped. "Your head was against my shoulder. And for 6 hours, my wolf was at peace. Not just present, at peace. Do you understand what that means for someone who has felt nothing for 2 years?" Eloin couldn't speak. The unguarded honesty in his voice had disarmed her completely. "I don't know what you are to me," Theron continued. "I don't know why my wolf chose you. But I need you to know that your being here isn't charity. It isn't obligation. Whatever is happening between us, it matters." She stared at him across the narrow corridor, her heart hammering. "Does your wolf have a preference for lavender salve?" she asked. Because if she didn't say something foolish, she was going to do something foolish, like close the distance between them and press her face into his chest, just to feel if his heartbeat was as fast as hers. Something cracked in his expression. Not a smile. The thing that happened right before a smile, in someone who had forgotten how. "Good night, Eloin," he said. "Good night, Your Majesty." He turned and walked down the corridor. She watched him go, and didn't move until his footsteps faded, and the silence settled back over the stones. Then she pressed her back against her door, put her hand over her racing heart, and whispered to no one. "Oh no." Because she recognized what was happening. She'd spent her whole life learning how to leave, how to keep her bag packed and her heart detached, and her expectations exactly at 0. And now, for the first time, she wanted to stay. The first episode at the palace happened on the 9th day. She was in the still room when it came. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, halfway through explaining to Thessaly's apprentice why you never boiled willow bark when you could steep it instead. The world tilted. The edges of her vision went soft, then dark. She had time to set down the glass vial in her hand, carefully, on the workbench. She had time to think. Not here. Not now. Please. Then the floor rushed up to meet her. Thessaly caught her before she hit the ground. The old healer moved faster than anyone her age had a right to, hooking an arm under Eloan's shoulders and easing her down onto the still-room floor. "Fetch the king," Thessaly told the apprentice, her voice sharp with authority. "No," Eloan managed, the words slurring. "Don't. He can't see me like—" Her eyes closed. The world went away. Farron arrived in under 4 minutes. Soren told her later that the king had been in a council session on the opposite side of the palace when something had apparently struck him like a fist to the sternum. He'd stopped mid-sentence, shoved back from the table, and walked out without a word of explanation to 8 bewildered councilmen. He'd known. His wolf had known the instant she went under. When he reached the still room, Thessaly was kneeling beside Eloan's unconscious body, checking her pulse. The old healer looked up at the king standing in the doorway, breathing hard, his eyes edged with gold, and said nothing. She didn't need to. He crossed the room and knelt beside her. His hand shook as he reached for Eloan's face. Thessaly watched him brush the hair from her forehead with a tenderness that looked like it was being torn out of him against his will. "How long will she be like this?" he demanded. His voice was rough. "I don't know." She said, "The episodes vary. Hours, sometimes days." Days. The word came out strangled. She mentioned it when she first arrived. She's been managing this condition her entire life. Alone, for the most part. That last part wasn't medically necessary. Thessaly said it anyway. The king's jaw tightened, and his hand settled more firmly against Eloan's cheek. He carried her to the guest chambers himself. Set her on the bed with the same careful tenderness he'd shown at Thornhollow. Then he sat in the chair beside her and didn't leave. 3 hours passed. The fire burned down to embers. Servants came and went with quiet efficiency, stoking the flames, leaving water and food he didn't touch. Soren appeared once in the doorway, took one look at the king's expression, and left without speaking. During those 3 hours, Theron's wolf did something it hadn't done in over 2 years. It surfaced fully, not the violent protective surge from Thornhollow, something quieter, deeper, a slow rising, like a tide coming in. He felt it spreading through his body. The heightened senses, the sharpening of sound and scent, the deep awareness of the woman lying unconscious beside him, every breath she took, registering in his bones. His wolf was grieving for her. Pressing against the inside of his chest, keening with a loss that felt ancient and bottomless. "Come back," he murmured, so quietly even Thessaly at the door couldn't hear. "Whatever you are to me, wherever you've gone, come back." Eloan was dreaming. But it wasn't a dream. The trees were wrong. That was the first thing she always noticed. Too tall, too pale. Their bark the color of bleached bone. Their branches bare and reaching upward like arms begging for mercy. The ground beneath her feet was soft, spongy, and covered in a layer of fine gray ash that stirred with every step but never settled. The ashwood. She'd been here before, many times. Every episode brought her back to this same terrible place. Had been bringing her here since she was a child. When she was younger, the ashwood had been empty. Just gray trees and gray sky and the suffocating absence of sound. It wasn't empty anymore. The shadow wolves had appeared when she was 14. Dark forms moving between the bone-white trunks, staying at the periphery, circling, watching. She could feel them, the way you could feel someone standing behind you in a dark room. They were closer now than they'd ever been. Eloan walked. She had learned long ago that standing still in the ashwood was worse than moving. Moving gave her the illusion of purpose, even though there was no destination in a place that had no edges. A sound reached her through the silence. Not a wolf, not wind, something else. Crying. Eloan stopped walking. The sound was coming from ahead, through a thicket of bone trees where the ash lay thicker on the ground. She pushed through the branches, ash falling from the bare limbs like dead snow, and stepped into a clearing. A man knelt at the center of it, old, broad-shouldered, even bent as he was. His hair was steel gray, and his hands were pressed flat against the ashen ground. His body shook with the kind of weeping that had gone past sound and become purely physical. He looked up when she entered the clearing. His eyes were dark and hollow, and filled with a grief so vast it made her stagger. She didn't know his face, but something about him. The military posture, even in collapse the breadth of him, triggered a memory. Thessaly's voice. He was the king's mentor, like a father to him. Valdric, Aloan whispered. The man flinched. You can see me? His voice was cracked, hollow. No one sees me. No one comes. I can see you, Eloan said, her own voice trembling. She knelt in the ash across from him. I'm here. Valdric stared at her with an expression that crumbled between hope and disbelief. How? You're alive. The living don't come here. I do, Eloan said. I've been coming here since I was a child. I don't know why. The old wolf shuddered. Then, you're a dreamwalker. He said the word like it was something from a legend. Born to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Something cold slid through Eloan's stomach. The dead? This place is where the broken wolves go, Valdric finished. When the hollowing takes you, the wolf doesn't die. It comes here. It wanders. It forgets. His hands clenched against the ground. I've been here for 2 years. 2 years of ash and silence, and things that hunt in the dark, the shadow wolves. They weren't just shapes, they were the hollowed wolves, stripped of their humanity, reduced to hunger and instinct. And you, she asked, you're not like them, not yet. The word yet carried the weight of a death sentence. The hollowing didn't finish me before the boy. His voice broke. Before Theron ended it, my body died, but my mind survived. I've been holding on. He looked at his hands, translucent at the edges, fading. I'm not sure for how much longer. Eloan's eyes burned with tears. He thinks he killed you. Valdric's face contorted. He saved me. The hollowing would have eaten me alive, turned me into one of those. He jerked his head toward the distant shapes circling beyond the tree line. What he did was mercy. But he'll never believe that. Tell him, Eloan whispered. If I can come here, if I can see you, maybe I can bring you a message. Valdric looked at her, and for the first time, something other than grief flickered in his eyes. Something fragile and terrified, and desperately, painfully close to hope. Tell the boy, his voice cracked. He pressed his fist against his mouth, breathed. Tried again. Tell him it wasn't his fault. Tell him I'm proud of the king he's become. And tell him, the tears fell freely now, carving clean lines through the ash on his weathered face. Tell him to forgive himself. Because I forgave him the moment the blade fell. Eloan reached for his hand. Her fingers passed through it, barely touching, like pressing against smoke. But Valdric felt it. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped, in the shudder that ran through him, in the sob that finally broke free. The boy carries guilt like armor, Valdric said quietly. But it's not protecting him, it's killing him. His wolf knows it, that's why it went silent. Half of it is here, in the ashwood, bound to me by grief he won't release. Eloan felt the blood drain from her face. Half of his wolf is here, tethered to me? To the guilt he refuses to let go. Valdric met her eyes. You're the bridge girl, the only one who can walk between worlds. If you don't help him, his wolf will tear itself apart, and he'll follow. The shadow wolves were closer now. She could hear them, the low, guttural breathing of things that had forgotten what it meant to be anything other than hungry. They could sense her. She was alive, warm, real, and they wanted what she had. You need to go, Valdric said urgently, his ghostly gaze snapping toward the circling shapes. They know you're here. They'll come for you. I'll come back, Eloan promised, standing. I'll come back, and I'll find a way to help. Valdric looked up at her from the ash. Be careful, Dreamwalker. The ashwood remembers everyone who enters, and it doesn't let go easily. Eloan woke gasping. She was back in the guest chambers. The fire had burned low. And Theron was beside her, his hand gripping hers so tightly. His knuckles had gone white, his face gray with worry, his wolf blazing behind his eyes. You're back, he breathed. Aloan stared at him, at his hand around hers, at the silver gold light burning in his eyes where his wolf pressed forward, and felt the weight of Valdrick's words settle over her like a stone. Half of his wolf was trapped in the ashwood, bound by guilt, dying slowly, and the man holding her hand had no idea. She opened her mouth, closed it. The truth sat on her tongue like a coal, burning, but she couldn't speak it. Not yet. Not like this. Not when he was looking at her with an expression that made it clear he'd been sitting in that chair for hours, terrified she wouldn't come back. Bad dream, she managed, her voice hoarse. Bad dream, he repeated, searching her face. He didn't believe her. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw, in the way his thumb moved unconsciously across her knuckles back and forth, a gesture so tender it made her want to weep. But he didn't push. He just held her hand and watched her breathe, and said nothing, and the silence between them felt like the most honest conversation they'd ever had. And in the dark behind her eyes, the shadow wolves circled closer. Eloan told Thessaly everything the next morning. She sat on the edge of the infirmary cot and let it all pour out. The ashwood, the bone-white trees, the shadow wolves, and Valdrick, alive, conscious, trapped for 2 years in a purgatory built from guilt and broken bonds. Thessaly listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. When Eloan finished, the silence lasted a long time. A dreamwalker, Thessaly said finally, the word spoken like something pulled from the bottom of a very old chest. Born with the ability to walk the space between living and dead. I thought it was mythology. It's not, Eloan said flatly. Your sleeping episodes, Thessaly said. Every time you fall asleep involuntarily, your mind crosses into the ashwood. You've been walking among the dead since you were a child. Eloan nodded, her throat tight. All those years of being called cursed. All those villages that had driven her out. All those nights of waking up gasping from a place she couldn't explain to anyone, because who would believe her? She hadn't been broken. She'd been something rare and ancient and entirely alone. That also explains how you entered Thornhallow, Thessaly added quietly. A sealed fortress with chained gates and no way in. Your gift drew you there. The ashwood guided you to the one place where a fractured wolf was tethered, even if you didn't know it. Eloan stared at her. She'd never questioned how she'd gotten past the gates. She'd just assumed she'd found a gap, a crack, some ordinary way in, but she couldn't actually remember entering at all. There's something else, Thessaly said, carefully, watching Eloan's face. Something the old texts mention that I need you to hear. Eloan looked up. Dreamwalkers pay a price. Child, every crossing takes something from you, a thread of your own essence left behind in the ashwood, like a toll paid at a gate. The more you cross, the more of yourself you leave there. Thessaly's voice was measured, clinical, but her eyes were gentle. Eventually, if you cross too many times, there won't be enough of you left on this side to wake up. The tea in Eloan's hands went cold. How many times? The texts don't say. It varies. But you've been crossing your entire life, Eloan. You may have less margin than you think. The words settled into her chest, like stones dropped into still water. She thought of Valdrick, fading at the edges, translucent, where his hands should have been solid. She thought of the shadow wolves, pressing closer every time she entered. She thought of Theron's thumb moving across her knuckles, unconscious, tender, the gesture of a man who didn't know he was already losing her. I have to tell him, Eloan said. About Valdrick, about the ashwood, about all of it. Yes, Thessaly agreed. You do. She found Theron in his study that evening, bent over dispatches in the warm light of a dying fire. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression softened the way it always did when he saw her. A loosening around his eyes, a fractional drop in the rigid line of his shoulders. It was so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but Eloan noticed everything about him now, and each small change felt like a gift she hadn't earned. I need to tell you something, she said, and you're not going to like it. Theron set down his pen. That's rarely a promising start. She told him about the ashwood. She described the bone trees, the ash, the suffocating silence. She told him about the shadow wolves. She watched his face darken, watched the storm building behind his eyes. Then she told him about Valdric. The change was immediate. The color drained from his face, as if someone had opened a valve. His hands went white-knuckled on the edge of the desk. He stood so abruptly, his chair scraped back across the stone floor, with a sound like a blade being drawn. "That's not possible," he said, his voice wrecked. "Valdric is dead. I killed him. I held his body. I felt him stop breathing." "His body died," Elowen said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was slamming against her ribs. "But his mind, his wolf, they survived. They're trapped in the ashwood. Theron, he's been there for 2 years, alone, aware, waiting for someone to find him." The king's breathing had gone shallow. His eyes were burning gold at the edges, his wolf pressing forward, reacting to every word with a violent, desperate agitation she could feel resonating through the bond. His hand gripped the edge of the desk so hard the wood groaned beneath his fingers. "You saw him," he said. "It wasn't a question. You spoke to him. He asked me to give you a message." Elowen's voice broke. She didn't fight it. "He said it wasn't your fault. He said the hollowing had already taken him, and what you did was mercy, not murder." He said, the tears came without warning, streaming down her face. "He said he forgave you the moment the blade fell. That his last human thought was gratitude. Gratitude. Theron, that you were strong enough to end what he couldn't." Theron made a sound, not a word. Something deeper, more animal, a gutted exhalation that came from the base of his chest and carried 2 years of unspoken grief in a single breath. He turned away from her. She watched his shoulders shake. He pressed both hands flat against the stone wall, his head bowed, and she could see the battle happening inside him. The part of him that wanted to break apart, warring with the part that had held itself together through sheer, grinding will. "For 2 years. There's more," Elowen said quietly. "Half of your wolf is trapped there with him. Tethered to the ashwood by the guilt you carry. That's why it went silent. And if the tether isn't broken, your wolf will die, and so will you." He was still facing the wall. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "And how do you propose to break it?" "I go back. I'm a dreamwalker. It's what I was born to do. I can enter the ashwood, find the piece of your wolf that's trapped, and bring it home." Theron turned around. The expression on his face froze her blood. "No, Theron, absolutely not." His voice had dropped to something low and dangerous, the voice of a king issuing a command he expected to be obeyed. "You are not going back into that place. I lost Valdric to the dark. I will not lose you. You'll lose yourself instead." Elowen shot back, her voice rising. "Your wolf is dying. Theron, I can feel it through." She stopped, catching herself too late. His eyes narrowed. "Through what?" "The bond. The thing neither of them had named." The pull she felt in her chest every time she was near him. The hollow pang every time she walked away. The deep, gravitational certainty that this man belonged to her in a way she couldn't explain and couldn't resist. "You know what?" she whispered. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. "All the more reason for you to leave." The word landed like a slap. "Leave. Leave the palace. Get as far from me as you can." His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Whatever is forming between us, if it ties your life to mine, then proximity to me is a death sentence. And I won't have your blood on my hands." "Theron, you can't. I can." He met her eyes, and the pain she saw there was so vast it stole her breath. "I am ordering you to go for your own safety. Please." The please again, the word he never used, now wielded like a blade. Lowen stared at him across the study, tears streaming down her face. She could feel his wolf howling inside him, could feel it throwing itself against his control, desperate and anguished, and begging him to stop. He was overriding his own wolf to push her away. The effort was visibly destroying him. "You're wrong about this," she said, her voice shaking. "And when you realize it, I'll be waiting." She turned and walked out. She kept her steps even, her spine straight, her chin level. She would not let the last image he had of her be someone fleeing. She made it to the corridor before the composure shattered. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, slid down to the floor and wept with her hand pressed against her mouth to muffle the sound. Because he could probably hear her. Because his wolf could definitely hear her. And because some part of her hoped he would come after her. He didn't. Eloan did not leave the capital. She left the palace because she had no choice. The guards at the East Wing had been given their orders, and their expressions when she'd tried to return to her chambers had been apologetic but immovable. She'd packed her satchel with steady hands and walked out the main gate with her spine straight and her eyes dry, because she would not give the watching court the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But she did not leave the city. She found work at a healer's shop in the lower district, a cramped, fragrant space run by an aging herbalist named Marin, who asked no questions and needed an extra pair of hands. Eloan brewed tinctures, treated minor ailments, and slept on a narrow cot behind the shop counter. She told herself it was practical. The capital was large enough to disappear in, and she had skills that were useful here. It had nothing to do with the fact that, leaving, truly leaving, putting miles and mountains between herself and Theron, felt like tearing something vital out of her chest. The bond was growing. She could feel it now, a constant pull behind her sternum, a magnetic ache that intensified with distance. It wasn't painful exactly. It was worse than pain. It was absence, a hollowness that no amount of work or distraction could fill. She'd catch herself pausing in the middle of crushing dried chamomile, her hands going still, her mind drifting toward the palace on the hill above the city. She could feel him there. A faint, persistent warmth at the edge of her awareness, like a hearth fire visible through a distant window. She wondered if he felt it too. She wondered if it was keeping him awake at night. She wondered if he stood at his windows the way she stood at hers, staring at the skyline and longing for something he'd chosen to refuse. Inside the palace, Theron was unraveling. Soren watched it happen with quiet, methodical concern. The king's wolf, which had been growing stronger by the day, had begun to withdraw again. Not the sudden silence of 2 years ago, but a slow, grinding retreat. Theron stopped eating full meals. He couldn't focus on documents. He stood at windows that faced the East Wing courtyard, staring at nothing. Twice, Soren found him in the corridor outside the guest chambers where Eloan had stayed, just standing there, like a man visiting a grave. "You could bring her back," Soren said on the 4th day, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "No," Theron said, without turning from the window. "She hasn't left the capital." Theron's shoulders stiffened. "Because I'm your beta and it's my job to know things you refuse to ask about." Soren paused. "She's working at a healer's shop in the lower district. She looks about as well as you do. Which is to say, terrible." Theron said nothing. His hands were fists at his sides. "Your wolf is fading again," Soren continued, his tone shifting to something harder. "Thessaly says you have months, maybe less. The tether in the ashwood is pulling what's left of it apart. And the one person who might be able to help is 6 streets away, waiting for you to stop being a martyr. Get out, Soren." The beta left. He didn't slam the door, which was somehow more damning than if he had. On the 5th day, Eloan had an episode. She was measuring dried valerian root into paper packets when the world tilted sideways without warning. No gradual dimming, this time, no soft fade. It hit her like a door slamming shut. Violent and total. She collapsed behind the counter, scattering herbs and glass bottles across the floor. Marin found her, seconds later, and couldn't wake her. The ashwood was worse this time. The shadow wolves were no longer circling at the edges. They were in the clearing, close enough that she could see them clearly. Massive, black-furred shapes with eyes like dead embers. They moved like smoke-given teeth. Valdric was barely visible. His form had gone nearly transparent, his edges dissolving into the ash. You came back, he rasped. You shouldn't have. I didn't choose to, Eloan said, her voice trembling. The episodes are getting worse. The ashwood is pulling you in. Valdrick's fading eyes were full of sorrow. It knows what you are now. It wants to keep you. A shadow wolf lunged. Eloan stumbled backward and felt its cold pass through her. Like ice water poured down her spine. She gasped, and for one terrible moment her vision went dark. When it returned, she could see her own hands, and they were faintly translucent at the fingertips. She was leaving pieces of herself behind. It was happening faster now. Go, Valdrick urged, his voice barely a whisper. Before, you can't? Eloan woke on the floor of Marin's shop, gasping and shaking. Her fingertips were numb. She held them up to the light and could see, just faintly, the shadow of the countertop through them. It took 20 minutes for the transparency to fade. Word reached the palace within the hour. Soren delivered it himself, walking into Theron's study and setting the report on his desk without preamble. She collapsed in a shop in the lower district. She was unconscious for 40 minutes. The shopkeeper says she woke up screaming. Theron's pen snapped in his hand. Ink splattered across the dispatch he'd been pretending to read. The bond is pulling her into the Ashwood, Theron, whether she's near you or not. Sending her away didn't protect her. It just made sure she's facing it, alone. Theron stood. The chair hit the floor behind him. He was out the door before Soren could say another word. He found her at Marin's shop, sitting on the cot in the back room, with a blanket around her shoulders, and her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking. She looked smaller than he remembered. Thinner, like the days apart had been hollowing her out from the inside, which he realized with sickening clarity they had been. She looked up when he filled the doorway, and the expression on her face nearly broke him relief, anger, longing, hurt, and beneath all of it, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with carrying a burden alone that was meant to be shared. You look terrible, she said. So do you. I wonder whose fault that is. The words cut, and he let them. He deserved them. He deserved worse than them. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her. The movement was so sudden, so completely at odds with every version of himself the world had ever seen, that Eloan flinched. A king didn't kneel. An alpha didn't kneel. But Theron Ashbane knelt on the floor of a cramped herbalist's shop and took her hands in his, and the contact sent a shockwave through both of them, the bond flaring like a fire that had been smothered and was finally desperately given air. I was wrong, he said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of everything but truth. I thought distance would keep you safe. Instead, he looked down at her hands in his. Show me your fingertips. She tried to pull back. He held on, gentle but firm, and turned her hands over. The tips of her fingers still had a faint translucence, barely visible unless you knew to look. His face went white. The ashwood is taking pieces of me, Eloan said quietly. Every time I cross over, I leave something behind. It's happening faster now. Because of the bond, Theron whispered, horror dawning. The tether pulling my wolf into the ashwood is pulling you in too. Thessaly tried to warn us both. You can't protect me by pushing me away, Theron. The bond doesn't care about distance. It doesn't care about orders. It just is. He pressed his forehead against her hands. She felt him shaking. I can't lose anyone else, he said, and the words came out so broken, so raw, that she understood this wasn't a king speaking. This was a boy who had lost everyone he'd ever loved and had decided that the safest thing was to never let anyone close again. Eloan freed one hand and cupped his jaw, tilting his face up. His eyes were red-rimmed and blazing gold, his wolf surging forward with desperate, urgent need. Then, stop trying to do this alone, she said. Let me in, all the way in. Let me help you, and let me stay. He leaned into her palm and closed his eyes, and the surrender in that gesture, the total exhausted release of a man who had finally run out of walls to hide behind, was the most devastating thing she had ever seen. All right, he whispered. All right. They went in together. It was Thessaly's idea. If Eloan was going to cross into the Ashwood again, she would not go alone, and the only way to bring Theron with her was through the bond itself. Skin to skin, heartbeat to heartbeat, his consciousness tethered to hers, as she crossed the threshold between worlds. They lay side by side on his bed in the king's chambers, the fire burning low, the curtains drawn. Thessaly and Sorin stood watch at the door. Though what they could do if something went wrong in a place they couldn't reach, no one said aloud. I don't know what it will feel like for you, Eloan told him. When I cross, it's like falling asleep and waking up somewhere else. But you're not a dream walker. The bond is the only thing carrying you. I understand, he said. If it doesn't work, it will work. She turned her head to look at him. He was already looking at her. In the firelight, the hard planes of his face had softened, and the gold in his eyes wasn't his wolf this time. It was something else. Something that made her breath catch with a warmth so fierce it frightened her. Theron, she whispered. I know, he said softly. I know. She reached for his hand, his fingers laced through hers, solid and warm and certain. She closed her eyes. She felt the pull, familiar, insistent, inevitable, and she let it take her. And this time, she felt him follow. The ashwood materialized around them, bone-white trees, stretching upward into a sky that wasn't a sky. Ash drifting down in slow spirals, the silence pressing in from every direction. Theron stood beside her, and the shock on his face told her everything. He recognized this place, not consciously but deeper than that. His body knew it. His wolf knew it. This is where it takes me, he murmured, looking around with hollow eyes. Every night. I never remember it fully, but I feel it. The weight of it. The cold. He pressed a hand to his chest. I wake up, and I can't breathe, and I never knew why. Now you know, Eloan said. She squeezed his hand. Stay close to me. They walked. The shadow wolves appeared almost immediately, slinking between the trees, more of them than Eloan had ever seen. Dozens. Their dead ember eyes tracked every step. But they didn't attack. They circled and watched and waited. They weren't afraid of her. They were afraid of him, even fractured. Even with half his wolf trapped in this place, Theron was an alpha. His presence rippled through the ashwood, like a stone dropped into still water. They found Valdric, in the same clearing. But the old captain was barely there. His form flickered like a candle in a draught. The ash had begun to cover him, settling on his shoulders like a burial shroud made of dust. Theron stopped. His hand went rigid in Eloan's grip. Valdric, he breathed. The ghost's eyes opened. For a moment, they were empty, unfocused, lost. Then they sharpened, and recognition flooded in. And the sound Valdric made was not human. It was a wolf's whimper, broken and desperate, and achingly, impossibly relieved. Boy, Valdric whispered. You came! Theron released Eloan's hand and walked forward. His legs were unsteady, his breathing was ragged. He crossed the clearing and dropped to his knees in the ash in front of the man who had been his father in every way that mattered. And for a long moment he couldn't speak. I killed you, Theron said. Finally the words came out mangled. I held your body, and You saved me, Valdric cut in, his fading voice fierce with conviction. The hollowing was eating me alive, Theron. What was left of me was teeth and hunger and rage. You ended the monster, not the man. The man was already gone. His ghostly hand reached out, hovering over Theron's bowed head. I felt the blade, boy, and my last human thought was, thank the gods, thank the gods. He's strong enough to do what I couldn't. Theron's composure shattered. It didn't crack or erode. It shattered, completely, the way a dam breaks, all at once, and everything behind it comes flooding out. 2 years of swallowed grief. 2 years of carrying guilt like a second skeleton inside his body, holding him rigid, holding him together, holding him apart from everything living. He wept, not quietly. The sound that tore out of him echoed through the ashwood, raw and terrible and necessary, and the bone trees shuddered, and the ash swirled, and even the shadow wolves went still. Eloan stood behind him, with tears streaming down her own face, and let him break. This was the wound. This was the thing that had to open before it could heal. When the storm subsided, Theron lifted his head. His face was wrecked. His eyes were clear. "I'm sorry," he said to Valdric. "I'm sorry I wasn't fast enough to save you before the hollowing took hold. I'm sorry I sealed Thornhallow instead of coming back for you. I'm sorry I spent 2 years grieving you as a monster when you were here the whole time waiting." Valdric smiled. "It was fragile and fading and heartbreaking. I was never waiting for an apology, son. I was waiting for you to stop punishing yourself." Eloan stepped forward. "Theron," her voice was gentle but urgent. "The tether, you have to let him go. The guilt that's binding half your wolf here, you have to release it, consciously, willingly." Theron looked at her, then at Valdric, then at the ash that was slowly, steadily swallowing the old man. "How?" "The same way I had to stop believing I was cursed." Eloan knelt beside him in the ash. "I spent my entire life thinking my sleeping episodes made me broken, that I was abandoned because something was wrong with me. Every village that turned me out confirmed it. Every night I woke up in this place, alone, I believed it a little more." She took his hand. "But the thing I hated most about myself, my curse, my crossing, is the reason I'm here right now. It's the reason I found you. The worst thing about me turned out to be the thing that saved us both." She squeezed his fingers. "Your guilt isn't protecting Valdric's memory, Theron. It's imprisoning him. And it's killing you. You are allowed to put it down." Theron stared at her. Then he turned to Valdric, and something changed in his face. Not a wall coming down. Something heavier than a wall. Something that had been calcified around his heart for 2 years. Load-bearing, structural. The thing he'd built his entire identity around since the night he'd held the blade. He let it go. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap. It was a breath, a single, long, shaking exhale that carried with it the weight of every night he'd spent, drowning in what he should have done differently. The tether broke. Eloan felt it snap through the bond, a release so sudden and vast it made her gasp. Warmth flooded into Theron like a river breaking through a dam. His wolf, the missing half, the piece that had been trapped in the ashwood for 2 years, came rushing back into him with a force that lit his eyes full gold. Valdric's form brightened for one impossible moment, solid again, whole again, the man he'd been before the hollowing, took everything. "There he is," Valdric murmured, looking at Theron with an expression of pure, radiant pride. "There's my king." The shadow wolves attacked. They came from every direction, silent and savage, pouring out of the bone trees like darkness given form. The first one lunged for Eloan, and Theron moved faster than thought. He shifted. Fully, completely. For the first time in over 2 years, his wolf erupted from his body in a transformation so violent and so beautiful that Eloan staggered backward. Midnight black fur, silver at the ruff, eyes blazing like molten gold. He planted himself between her and the shadows and unleashed a roar that shook the ashwood to its roots. The shadow wolves scattered, fleeing into the bone trees, into the ash, into the dark spaces between the dead. The silence that followed felt different, lighter, less hungry. Valdric was dissolving, not painfully, gently. The ash was releasing him, and his edges softened like morning fog burning off in sunlight. "Take care of each other," Valdric said, his voice a whisper now, warm and fading and at peace. "That's an order from your old captain." He closed his eyes. He smiled. And he was gone. Theron shifted back to human form. He was on his knees in the ash, trembling and spent. And Eloan was beside him in an instant, wrapping her arms around him, pressing her face into his shoulder. "I'm here," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere." The ashwood dissolved around them. They woke tangled together in his bed. The fire burned to embers, the room bathed in the gray light of early dawn. Theron's arms were locked around her, his face buried in her hair, and she could feel it. His wolf, whole and burning and magnificently, impossibly alive inside him, and she could feel something else. A warmth in her chest, golden and fierce and settled, like a key clicking into a lock, the bond, complete, sealed. Not by ceremony or ritual or declaration, but by the simple, overwhelming truth of two people who had walked into the dark together and chosen to bring each other back. Theron pulled away just enough to look at her. His eyes were clear gray again, his wolf settled, his face ravaged by tears and exhaustion, and something that looked terrifyingly like joy. "Your fingers," he said, taking her hand. Eloan looked down, solid, whole. Not a trace of translucence. The ashwood had let her go. She laughed, a wet, broken, brilliant sound, and Theron kissed her. He kissed her like a man who had just learned that the world contained something other than grief, and she kissed him back with everything she had, every homeless night, every moment she'd spent believing she was broken, all of it transmuted into this single luminous point of contact. They held each other in the growing light and breathed. The wolf didn't heal overnight. Theron still woke, in the dark sometimes, gasping, reaching for ghosts that weren't there. The guilt didn't evaporate just because he'd chosen to release it. It returned in small waves, a face in a crowd that reminded him of Valdric, a sound that echoed wrong, the smell of mountain air on certain mornings when the wind came down from the Greymark. But Eloan was there, every time. She'd reach for him in the dark, and her hand would find his, and his wolf would settle, and the ghosts would thin. Her episodes didn't stop entirely. Thessaly had warned her. They might not. The ashwood was part of her. But the crossings were gentler now, shorter. The shadow wolves kept their distance. And sometimes, when she walked the bone tree clearings, she found other lost souls and guided them toward the light, the way she'd guided Valdric. She became known quietly in the way that mattered. The dreamwalker who sat at the Alpha King's side. The foundling who had done what no healer, no warrior, no council of nobles had managed in 2 years. She'd brought the king's wolf home. The court whispered, because courts always whispered. "A stray," someone said once, within earshot of Theron. And the look the king gave that particular nobleman ensured the word was never spoken again. "They'll adjust," Theron told her one evening, pulling her against his chest in the firelight. "And if they don't, they can take it up with their king. And his wolf," Eloan added. "And his wolf," he agreed, his voice warm, with something that sounded unmistakably like contentment. Months later, on a morning so ordinary it could have been any morning, Eloan woke to pale light filtering through the curtains, and the steady sound of breathing. Beside her Theron lay on his back, one arm draped across her waist. His face was peaceful, truly peaceful. The hard lines softened, the tension unwound. The grief still present, but no longer load-bearing. She watched him sleep and felt her wolf stir gently inside her, settled and warm and answered by the deep, steady pulse of his. No ash, no fog, no circling shapes in the dark. Just morning light and warmth, and the quiet miracle of two people who had been lost their entire lives, finally finding the place where they belonged. Eloan closed her eyes, pressed closer, and slept.